There is a building in Shinjuku that does not exist on any modern map. Not because it was demolished, not because the records were lost in a fire or a flood or the ordinary entropy of bureaucratic negligence. It does not exist on any modern map because someone, at some point between 1945 and now, made a very deliberate decision that it should not. I know this because I am the person who found it. I want to be precise about something before I go any further, because precision is the only thing I have left that feels solid. I am not a person who believes in hauntings. I am not a person who uses words like cursed or evil in any register other than the clinical or the historical. I have a doctorate in subsurface archaeological survey methodology from Waseda University. I have spent 11 years of my professional life in the dirt, in the dark, in conditions that would make most people turn around and go home. I have excavated mass graves in Okinawa. I have cataloged remains from the firebombing sites in Osaka. I have held bones that were still warm from the friction of the excavation brush and written the measurements down in a notebook without flinching, because that is the work, and the work requires you to stay level. I am telling you all of this so that what I am about to describe is not mistaken for the testimony of someone who arrived at Grid 7 Alpha looking for something frightening. I was not. I was looking for drainage infrastructure from the Meiji period. I found something else entirely. And what it did to me, it did slowly, and it did it by being completely and utterly real. The survey assignment came through the Metropolitan Government's urban renewal pipeline in late February of 2019. The city was preparing to expand a subsurface utility corridor running beneath the western edge of Shinjuku Ward, a project that had been in planning for several years and required a standard archaeological clearance survey before any groundbreaking could proceed. My team was contracted to conduct what we expected to be a 3 to 5 day walkover and subsurface scan. The area in question sat between two busy commercial blocks, the kind of unremarkable urban compression you find everywhere in central Tokyo convenience stores, a parking structure, a cluster of salaryman ramen shops with their laminated menus and their overhead fluorescents. Nothing about the surface suggested anything unusual. That is almost always how it begins. I arrived on the morning of March 4th with my research assistant, a second-year graduate student named Reiko Sasamoto, and our survey technician, Fumio Hayashi, who had worked with me on 4 previous projects and who I trusted completely. We had a ground-penetrating radar unit, a Leica total station, a full set of mapping software running on a ruggedized laptop, soil coring equipment, and the standard documentation kit, waterproof notebooks, pH testing strips, a set of trowels graded from 0.5 millimeters to 12, and 3 oil lamps I bring on every subsurface survey as backup lighting, partly out of habit and partly because I have learned not to rely entirely on battery-powered equipment in enclosed spaces. The access point was a utility hatch behind a parking attendant's booth, the kind of corrugated steel door that you would walk past 1,000 times without registering. The Metropolitan Government's liaison, a man named Mr. Oshiro, who wore a surgical mask and kept his clipboard at a very precise 45-degree angle, let us in at 7:45 a.m. and told us the hatch would be resecured at 6 p.m., regardless of where we were in the survey. I noted this in my field journal as a standard logistical constraint. I did not find it unusual at the time. The subsurface space below Grid 7 Alpha presented initially as a decommissioned drainage corridor, exactly the kind of Meiji-era infrastructure we had been briefed to expect. The walls were brick, the good dense kind they stopped making after the war, laid in a stretcher bond that dated stylistically to between 1890 and 1910. The floor was compacted earth over a rubble substrate, and the ceiling height was approximately 2 meters in the main corridor, dropping to just under 1 meter 40 in the lateral branches. At approximately 5 meters north of the access hatch, a continuous band of limestone ran at floor level across the full width of the corridor, a boundary marker original to the drainage system's construction, the kind of feature used in Meiji-era infrastructure to delineate jurisdictional or functional zones. I noted it in my field journal, logged it as unremarkable, and moved on. Fumio ran the ground-penetrating radar along the main axis, while Reiko logged soil samples from 3 coring points we established at 4-meter intervals. I was sketching the brickwork in my field notebook and noting the mortar composition, which appeared to be a lime-sand mix consistent with the Meiji period and in reasonably good condition for its age. Everything was consistent. Everything was what it should have been. It was Reiko who noticed the first thing that was not. She called me over to the 3rd coring point with a tone of voice that I recognized from my own early career, the carefully controlled excitement of someone who has found something they cannot immediately explain and is trying to remain professional about it. The soil sample from point 3, taken at a depth of approximately 1 meter 30 below the corridor floor, contained a layer of material that did not belong to any natural or infrastructural depositional sequence. It was a compacted organic layer, dark brown shading, almost to black, with a distinctive greasy quality to the touch that I have encountered before in only 2 contexts: organic decomposition at volume and accelerant residue from deliberate burning. I sent the sample for field pH testing. It came back at 5.2, significantly acidic, consistent with large-scale biological decomposition. I noted this in the field journal. I noted it carefully and without alarm, because acidic organic layers in urban subsurface contexts have many mundane explanations, and it was too early to speculate. But I kept looking at the brickwork. I had been logging the stretcher bond as consistent with Meiji-era construction, and it was in the main corridor. In the lateral branch that extended northward from a point approximately 17 meters from the access hatch, the brickwork changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would register as alarming on a casual inspection. But I have spent 11 years looking at brickwork, and the bond pattern in the northern branch was wrong for Meiji-era construction. It was wrong in a way that was right for a different period entirely. The coursing was slightly irregular, the mortar a different color in the lamplight, more gray, less yellow, and the brick itself was a different size, thinner, flatter. The kind of rapid production brick that became common in Japan in the 1930s and early 40s when industrial manufacturing was being redirected toward the war effort. Someone had built something down here during the war, and then someone else had bricked it over. I want to be very clear that at this point I was not frightened, I was fascinated. The professional part of my brain, the part that has been dominant for most of my adult life, was already constructing hypotheses and prioritizing the additional survey work that would need to be done. Wartime subsurface construction beneath Shinjuku was not in itself surprising. The city had been extensively modified during the conflict, and large amounts of that modification were never properly documented. We had found something genuinely interesting. This happened sometimes, and when it happened, you documented it carefully and you wrote it up, and eventually it added a small but real increment to the sum of historical knowledge. I told Fumio to run the GPR along the northern lateral. I told Reiko to begin a measured photographic record of the brickwork transition zone. I updated my field journal with precise compass bearings and dimensions. And then the GPR unit returned a reading that made Fumio go very quiet. He brought the readout to me without saying anything. He simply turned the screen so I could see it. The ground-penetrating radar had detected a void space beyond the wartime brickwork. This was expected. There was clearly a sealed room or corridor on the other side. What was not expected was the size of the void. The GPR signal indicated a space extending at least 9 meters north-south and at least 6 meters east-west, with what appeared to be internal structural divisions, partial walls, raised platform features, something along the eastern boundary that the software was interpreting as a series of cylindrical objects arranged in a regular pattern. The void was not Meiji-era drainage infrastructure. We had found a sealed room, a large one, and it had been sealed from the outside. I made 3 phone calls at that point. The first was to the Metropolitan Government Liaison, Mr. Oshiro, to inform him of the discovery and request an extension of our survey window. He did not answer. I left a message. The second call was to my department head at the university, Prof. Murata, who told me to document everything, touch nothing structural, and call him again the next morning. The third call was to a colleague of mine, Dr. Naomi Fujishiro, who specializes in wartime urban archaeology and whose knowledge of Tokyo's subsurface history is, in my professional opinion, unmatched. She answered on the second ring. When I described the void dimensions and the brickwork transition date, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in a very careful voice, "Yuki, what ward did you say this was?" I told her. "Shinjuku, Western Edge, the Utility Corridor Project." Another silence. "There are records," she said slowly, "that I accessed 3 years ago as part of a research inquiry that was subsequently closed. Records that place a secondary research installation of Unit 731 in central Tokyo, not in Manchuria, here, in the city. The records were fragmentary and the site was never located. The inquiry was closed because," she paused, "because someone decided it should be." I stood in the corridor beneath Shinjuku with my oil lamp and my field notebook, and I felt the first real shift in my understanding of what I was standing inside. Not fear, not yet, but a reorientation. The kind that happens when the scale of something becomes suddenly viscerally clear. Unit 731. I am going to pause here and tell you what that means, because I think it is important that you understand it fully, not as an abstraction or a historical footnote, but as a specific and concrete reality. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, operating primarily from a facility in Pingfang, Manchuria, a facility that, if you viewed it from the air, was large enough to be mistaken for an entire town. It had its own water supply, its own power plant, its own railway siding. It employed over 3,000 personnel at its peak. Its official designation was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, which is perhaps the most extraordinary piece of bureaucratic euphemism in the entire history of organized human violence. Between 1936 and 1945, the personnel of Unit 731 conducted experiments on living human subjects at a scale and with a deliberateness that has no equivalent in the documented history of scientific research. They infected people with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and syphilis. They performed vivisections without anesthesia to study the progression of disease in living tissue. They froze limbs and rewarmed them repeatedly to study frostbite. They placed subjects in pressure chambers and increased the pressure until their eyes extruded from their sockets. They detonated fragmentation grenades at measured distances from bound subjects to study wound patterns. They tested flamethrowers and chemical agents on people who were restrained and could not move. The subjects were overwhelmingly Chinese and Korean civilians and prisoners of war, though Russian, Mongolian, and other nationalities were also recorded. They were referred to in the unit's documentation not by name, not by nationality, but by the word maruta, logs. They were referred to as logs. Conservative historical estimates place the death toll from Unit 731's direct experimental activities at between 3,000 and 12,000 individuals. When you factor in the field deployment of biological weapons, the contamination of water supplies, the aerial dispersal of plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, the poisoning of wells, the figure attributed to the unit's operations rises to somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 deaths. Shirō Ishii, the unit's founder and commanding officer, was never prosecuted. He was granted immunity by the United States government in exchange for the experimental data his unit had generated. He died in Tokyo in 1959 of throat cancer. He received a funeral. People attended. I want to stay with that immunity for a moment because I think it is one of the most consequential decisions in the history of modern science, and it is almost never discussed in proportion to its consequences. The United States Army's biological warfare program, operating after the war, made a calculation. The data that Ishii's unit had collected on human physiological response to plague, cholera, frostbite, decompression, and dozens of other stresses was data that could not be collected ethically. It could not be collected on animals with the same ecological validity. It had been collected on human beings at a scale and with a rigor that no legitimate research program could replicate, and the Army wanted it. The Army decided that the value of the data outweighed the value of the prosecution. That what the data could tell American researchers about how to build better biological weapons was worth more than what the prosecution could tell the world about accountability. This was a policy decision made at the highest levels of the United States military establishment. It was not a bureaucratic accident or an oversight or a failure of process. It was a choice. And the direct consequence of that choice is that the men who ran Unit 731 came home to Japan and lived out their natural lives. Several of them became doctors. Several of them became professors. Several of them joined the faculty of the medical and pharmaceutical institutions that now form part of Japan's public health infrastructure. They gave lectures. They published papers. They trained students who are currently practicing medicine in hospitals within 20 minutes of where I am sitting writing this. The knowledge that the data produced in facilities like the one beneath me fed directly into legitimate post-war scientific literature, that it was laundered through the process of academic publication and peer review and citation until its origins became invisible, is something that I cannot resolve into any framework that makes sense to me. It is simply a fact, enormous and immovable, and without any adequate response. I am telling you all of this because you need to understand what I was standing beneath when Naomi Fujishiro said the words, "secondary research installation," on the phone that morning. I need you to understand the weight of that phrase. The Pingfang facility was the primary location, but the unit maintained subsidiary operations in multiple locations throughout occupied Asia, smaller facilities where specific research programs were conducted, where results were compiled, where certain experiments took place, that even within the unit's own appalling internal culture were considered sensitive enough to require additional geographic separation. The Tokyo installation, if it existed, would have been extraordinary for one reason above all others. It would mean that the experiments were not confined to occupied territory. They were not hidden behind the geographical alibi of Manchuria. They were here in the capital, beneath the streets. And they were hidden so completely that 80 years of urban development, seismic reconstruction, and archaeological survey had passed over them without detection. I called Mr. Oshiro again. He still did not answer. We continued the survey. I want to be precise about this decision because I have thought about it many times since, sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m. with a cup of tea I forgot to drink, and I still believe it was the correct professional decision. We had found a sealed subsurface space of historical significance. Our mandate was to survey and document. We surveyed and documented. Fumio found a section of the wartime brickwork where the mortar had deteriorated to the point of structural compromise, not through any action of ours, simply through the passage of time and the particular moisture conditions of that stratum. A section approximately 30 centimeters by 20 centimeters had partially separated from the surrounding course. He photographed it from every angle before touching it. Then, with a pair of gloved hands and a level of care that I will always respect him for, he eased it free. The air that came through the gap was wrong. I do not know how else to describe it. It was not cold, which would have been unusual but explicable. It was not foul-smelling in the way that organic decomposition produces a foul smell, the sour biological tang that I know from field experience, and that triggers an automatic respiratory response. It was something more neutral than that, and more disturbing for being neutral. It smelled like a space that had been sealed for a very long time, and in which something had happened that had changed the fundamental chemistry of the air in ways that simple decomposition alone could not account for. There was a faint chemical undertone, astringent, almost medicinal, that I later identified, when I was able to think clearly again, as consistent with residual formaldehyde off-gassing from preserved biological material. I lit a second oil lamp and held it near the gap. The flame did not gutter or change character, which told me the oxygen content of the space beyond was adequate. I looked through. The room was large. I could see, in the lamplight, that the GPR reading had been accurate. It was at least 9 meters in depth from where I was standing, and the ceiling height was consistent with the main corridor, approximately 2 meters. The floor was concrete rather than compacted earth, which was consistent with 1930s construction methods. Along the eastern wall, exactly where the GPR had identified cylindrical objects arranged in a regular pattern, there were, I am going to use the precise technical language here, because it is the only way I can write this without my hands starting to shake. There were glass and ceramic vessels, large ones, arranged on what appeared to be metal shelving units, the kind of heavy industrial shelving used in laboratory or storage contexts. Some of the vessels were intact. Some had failed, and their contents had dried or desiccated across the shelving and the floor beneath. I could not see the contents clearly from the gap. I could see that there were contents. Fumio enlarged the gap. It took him 20 minutes, working carefully and methodically, removing bricks one at a time and stacking them on a ground cloth he had laid out behind him. Reiko was filming continuously on a handheld camera, narrating in a low professional voice that I could hear breaking slightly around the edges every few minutes before she brought it back under control. I was writing in my field notebook, filling pages with measurements and observations, doing the thing that has always helped me stay present and functional in difficult situations, which is to keep the hand moving and the language technical. We went inside. The room was a laboratory. There is no other word for it. The shelving along the east wall was part of a larger system that lined 3 sides of the space, and on these shelves, in various states of preservation or deterioration, were the material remnants of a working biological research facility. I cataloged what I could see without touching anything. Glass specimen jars in graduated sizes, the kind used in pathology and biological specimen preservation, ceramic containers with fitted lids, metal trays and implements that I recognized from their form as surgical or dissection tools, documentation paper files, bound in what had been cloth covers and were now mostly brown-black organic masses, though some individual pages had survived in the drier upper sections of the shelving, and equipment, centrifuges, a microscope, or the remains of one, what appeared to be an autoclave unit, a device for heat sterilizing equipment mounted against the south wall. I want to tell you what a laboratory looks like when it has been sealed for 8 decades because I think that specificity matters. I think the details matter in a way that the broad horror of the history can sometimes obscure. A sealed laboratory does not look catastrophic. It does not look like violence or urgency or fear. It looks, in many ways, deeply ordinary, like a workspace that was set down in the middle of a task and never returned to. The instruments are still arranged on their trays in a way that suggests someone cared about their organization. The files are stacked, not scattered. The specimen jars on the upper shelves, where the conditions were driest and the preservation best, could pass a cursory glance as a routine pathology archive from any hospital or university from the same period. I have been in university basement storage rooms that felt more disordered than this space felt. That is what made it so difficult to process. The ordinariness of the arrangement, the implicit professionalism of the layout. Someone had worked here carefully, methodically, with attention to procedure and record keeping and the disciplined organization of instruments. Someone, many someones, had come to this space every day as to a job, had set out their tools with the same attention. A carpenter sets out chisels, had logged their results in the same registers and protocol sheets that any academic researcher would use, and then had gone home. They had gone home to somewhere in the city above me. They had eaten dinner and slept in beds and perhaps had children who asked them what they did for work, and they had given those children some version of an answer, and the work itself had continued here below the streets in this space that smelled of formaldehyde and time. The mineral dust that covered every surface was uniform and undisturbed, which was its own specific kind of testimony. Mineral dust accumulates slowly and settles evenly when air movement is absent. The layer I was looking at, perhaps 3 millimeters on the horizontal surfaces, thicker in the corners represented, depending on the humidity and particulate conditions in that sealed space, somewhere between 60 and 90 years of deposition. No one had been in this room since the door was bricked over. The dust said so. It said, "So, with the authority of physics, which is a form of authority I have always trusted more than most." And still, standing in that layer of settled time, holding an oil lamp in one hand and my field notebook in the other, I found that I could not stop looking at the drain outlets at the base of the south wall. And the central feature of the room, which I have been building toward because even now, 4 years later, writing this in the knowledge that no one may ever read it, I find it difficult to describe without first preparing you. A series of raised concrete platforms, evenly spaced across the central floor space, 6 of them, each approximately 2 meters long and 70 centimeters wide, each fitted with metal ring anchors at regular intervals along the sides. Tables. They were tables. And the ring anchors were restraints. I stood between 2 of these tables and I looked at the ring anchors, which were still in place, still bolted into the concrete. And I thought about the word Maruta, and I thought about 3,000 people or 12,000 people or 500,000 people, and I did not cry. I was not at a point yet where crying was available to me. I was at a point where the scale of what I was standing inside had exceeded the capacity of my emotional processing, and what fills that space when emotion is not available is a very cold and very clear form of attention. And standing there between those tables, in that particular smell of formaldehyde and sealed time, with the jars on the shelves behind me and the restraint anchors under my hands, I thought again about the immunity, about the data produced on surfaces exactly like the ones I was touching being handed to American researchers in exchange for a decision that no court would ever review. The data from this room, from these tables, from these jars, did not disappear when the bricks went in. It moved. It passed through the academic publication process and the peer review process and the citation process until its origins became invisible, and it is still in circulation, still being cited, still informing research that has no idea where it came from. That is a fact that sits in the room alongside the physical facts, enormous and immovable and without any adequate response. I started to read the wall. Along the northern wall, which I had not been able to see clearly from the gap, there was writing. Not graffiti, not informal inscription, formal documentation, painted or stenciled directly onto the concrete in the systematic notation style of wartime imperial Japanese military record keeping. Some of it was damaged by moisture and time, but some of it was intact. And what I could read was a series of experimental protocol identifiers, numbered sequentially, accompanied by dates and dosage specifications, and what I believe were subject identification codes. The dates ran from 1941 to 1945. The last entry was dated August 14th, 1945. The day before the surrender announcement, whatever was done in this room was done until the very last possible moment. I photographed the wall in its entirety, overlapping frames to ensure complete coverage. I photographed the shelving and its contents. I photographed the tables and the restraint anchors. I photographed the floor, which in certain areas near the drain outlets at the base of the south wall showed staining that I will not describe in more detail than that. Reiko photographed everything I photographed and additional details I had not registered. Fumio ran the GPR unit along the internal walls and found 2 additional sealed lateral spaces, smaller ones, that we did not enter. And then, in the northeastern corner of the room, behind a collapsed section of shelving that must have failed at some point in the past several decades and brought a portion of the eastern wall storage down with it, I found the document. It was in a metal canister, the kind used for film storage, and the canister had been sealed well enough to protect its contents from the worst of the moisture damage. Inside was a single bound document, approximately 40 pages, with a typed cover sheet. The cover sheet was in Japanese, and I read it there in the lamplight, standing in my field gloves, with the oil lamp held up with my other hand, and I will give you the translation as precisely as I am able. It read, Preliminary Findings and Subject Disposition Record, Tokyo Research Annex, Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department Special Section 5. Compiled by order of the commanding officer to be destroyed upon facility closure. It had not been destroyed. Whether this was oversight or intention, I cannot tell you. Whether someone sealed it in that canister and left it deliberately as an act of conscience or documentation, or whether the order to destroy it was simply not carried out in the chaos of the final days, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that the document existed, and that I carried it out of that room in my survey bag, and that what I have read of its contents in the months since has not left me. I will not reproduce the specific experimental records here. I have provided them to Prof. Murata and to Naomi Fujishiro and to 2 other parties whose identities I have agreed not to disclose. What I will tell you is that the document confirms the existence of a Tokyo-based subsidiary operation of Unit 731, that it records the processing of at least 47 individuals described by the same dehumanizing coded nomenclature used at the Pingfang facility, and that it contains, in its final section, a set of instructions for the facility's closure that included the sealing of the access point, the bricking over of the entrance corridor, and the removal of all surface-level identifying features. The instructions were signed, The signature has been verified by 2 independent document specialists as consistent with the authenticated signature samples of Shirō Ishii. He knew. He knew this facility was here. He directed its closure and its concealment personally. And then he came back to Tokyo, and he lived here for 14 years after the war, and he died here, and his existence was never at any official level connected to what was beneath the streets he walked on. It was on the 3rd day of the survey, March 6th, that things began to change in ways I do not have a professional vocabulary for. I had returned to the room alone. Fumio was running extended GPR sweeps in the main corridor, and Reiko was logging samples at the surface level to complete the photographic documentation of the north wall. I had been in the room for perhaps 30 minutes, working systematically from west to east across the written surface, when I became aware of a sound. It was very faint, it was rhythmic, and it was coming from behind the sealed lateral space in the northwestern corner of the room. I stood very still, and I listened and I timed it. The interval between repetitions was approximately 4 seconds. The character of the sound was a low, resonant, percussive note, not a knock, not a tap, but something between the two. A sound with duration rather than a point impact. Like something being pressed against the interior of the wall, with slow, deliberate regularity. I told myself the building was settling. Old structures do this. Temperature changes, moisture movement, the slow creep of subsurface pressure, all of these produce sounds in enclosed spaces that are easy to misattribute. I told myself this, and I believed it, and I continued working. The sound stopped after approximately 3 minutes. I noted it in the field journal as structural settling, rhythmic, possible moisture-related expansion in northwest lateral, and I moved on. On March 7th and March 9th, we completed the photographic documentation of the eastern shelving and ran extended soil coring along the south wall, work that required full concentration and produced nothing anomalous. I noted this in the field journal. The ordinariness of those days has its own quality in retrospect. I did not know they were the last ordinary days of the survey. On the 5th day, March 8th, Reiko told me she had heard voices. She told me in the way that people tell you things they are afraid will not be believed quickly, watching my face, already half preparing to retract the statement if my expression gave her reason to. She said she had been alone in the main corridor, logging the final set of brickwork photographs, and she had heard, from the direction of the sealed room, a sound that was indistinguishable to her from a human voice. Not words, not anything intelligible, a vocal quality, a register and a timbre that her nervous system had immediately and involuntarily classified as human. I asked her to describe the sound more precisely. She said it was low. She said it had a quality she could only describe as patient, like something that was not in a hurry, like something that had been there for a very long time and had no particular reason to rush. I told her that enclosed spaces with complex internal acoustics frequently produce sounds that the brain's auditory processing classified as voice-like, a phenomenon called audio pareidolia, the sonic equivalent of seeing faces in clouds. I told her this was well documented and that she should log it in the field journal and not worry about it. I was not worried about it. I was not worried about it because I could not afford to be worried about it. Because if I was worried about it, I would have to think about the sound I had heard on March 6th, and I did not want to think about it in a new context. March 9th was the day Fumio took the GPR reading he would not tell me about for 3 more days. I did not know this at the time. I was working in the main corridor, logging instrument calibration data, and thinking about nothing except the work, which is the condition I have always preferred, and which was, by that point in the survey, becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. On March 10th, I heard it again. I was alone. It was not structural settling. It was in the sealed lateral space in the northwestern corner, and it was the same rhythmic sound as before, the same interval, the same duration. But this time there was something else beneath it. Something that my brain, working very hard to process and input, it did not have a category for, eventually identified as a change in register. The sound rose slightly at the end of each cycle. The way the pitch of a human voice rises at the end of a question. I left the room and I sat in the main corridor for 11 minutes. I know exactly how long it was because I wrote it in the field journal. I wrote left the room at 11:14 a.m., returned at 11:25 a.m., and under the entry I wrote only the word structural because that was the word I needed the entry to say. On March 11th, I did not go back into the sealed room. I told myself this was because the surface level documentation required attention. This was partly true. I spent the day with Reiko, cross-referencing our photographic record against the field sketches, and I was productive, and I did not think about the sound more than perhaps once every 20 minutes. On March 13th, I returned to the room for instrument retrieval and completed it in 14 minutes without hearing anything. I noted this in the field journal. I noted the absence as carefully as I had noted the presence. On March 12th, Fumio asked me if we could talk. We had worked together for 4 years and across 4 projects, and in all of that time, he had never asked me if we could talk. He always just talked. He was not a man who requested conversations. He simply had them. The formality of the request told me something before he said a word. He said he had been running the extended GPR sweeps, and that he needed to tell me about a reading he had taken from the northwestern lateral on March 9th. He said he had not told me immediately because he had rerun the sweep twice to confirm the result before reporting it. The northwestern lateral, which the initial GPR assessment had identified as a sealed void space consistent with a storage or secondary laboratory function, had returned a different reading on March 9th. The initial reading had shown a static void with no internal structural movement. The March 9th reading showed, and Fumio was very precise about this, very careful with his language in the way that people are careful when they are describing something that they know sounds wrong. The March 9th reading showed a pattern of internal pressure variation, cyclical, at a frequency and interval consistent with, and I am reading directly from the notes Fumio gave me, biological respiratory function. Fumio did not say the word breathing. He said biological respiratory function. I understood that this was because saying breathing would have required him to accept an implication that he was not prepared to accept. I was not prepared to accept it either. But I listened to the recording of the rhythm on March 6th again, on my phone, in the main corridor while Fumio stood 3 meters away and looked at the wall, and the interval was 4 seconds. A slow breath. The kind of breath taken by something that is conserving energy. The kind of breath taken by something that has been taking breath slowly and patiently in the dark for a very long time. On March 14th, the lights in the main corridor, our portable LED strips, fully charged that morning, failed simultaneously at 3:17 p.m. In the dark, with only the oil lamps, the sound from the northwestern lateral was much clearer. It had changed. The rhythmic quality was still there, but it had been joined by something that moved over the 4 minutes we stood in the dark before Fumio got the emergency torch working through several distinct registers. Low to slightly higher, higher to lower, again. The way pitch moves through a range when a sound that is not quite language is trying to become language. I want to be exact here because the alternative to being exact is to be imprecise, and imprecision is a form of protection I no longer feel I am entitled to. The sound in the dark in that corridor sounded like a person who had been kept in a sealed space for a very long time and had forgotten most of the mechanics of human speech, attempting slowly and without urgency to remember them. We left the subsurface space at 3:32 p.m. on March 14th. We came back the next morning, March 15th, because the work was not done, and because leaving would have required me to articulate a reason, and the only reason I had was one I could not write in a field report. On March 15th, the sound was not in the northwestern lateral, it was in the main corridor, 3 meters from the access hatch. The same rhythm, the same patient, rising quality at the end of each cycle, as if it had moved through the sealed brickwork, through 9 meters of wartime concrete, through the gap we had created and then left open, and into the space where we walked. It had moved northward from the sealed lateral, through the main room, through the gap, into the corridor, and it had stopped 3 meters from the hatch, which placed it, I would later calculate from my field sketches, approximately 2 meters north of the limestone threshold. It had not crossed the line. It was at the line. It was as close to the surface as the limestone would permit it to come. I called Naomi Fujishiro that afternoon. I described the sounds. I described the GPR reading. I described the movement. I used professional language throughout because professional language was the only frame I had for any of this. And when I was done, there was a silence on the line, and then she said something that I have not been able to put down since. She said, "The records I found 3 years ago, the ones from the closed inquiry, they included a notation about the closure of the Tokyo facility. The notation said that not all personnel were successfully extracted before sealing. It said that the records pertaining to those personnel were classified under a separate category. The category was marked with a term I had to look up. The term was Maruta disposition uncertain. Logs of uncertain disposition. On March 16th, we found that the section of brickwork we had removed to access the room had been partially reconstructed. Not fully, not neatly, but approximately 6 bricks that Fumio had stacked carefully on the ground cloth had been replaced in the gap in the correct orientation, though without mortar. As if something had understood the principle of the barrier and had attempted from one side or the other to restore it. I sat with this fact for a long time before I was able to do anything productive with it. I sat with it in the main corridor with my field notebook open on my knee and the oil lamp set on the floor beside me, and I thought about what it means for something to understand the principle of a barrier. To recognize that a gap in a wall constitutes an opening. To understand that an opening had been closed before, and that closing it again was the appropriate response to its existence. These are not simple cognitive operations. They require a model of the physical world, a model of before and after, a concept of interior and exterior, and the membrane between them. I had been telling myself from March 6th onward that what I was hearing was a geological or acoustical phenomenon. I had been telling myself this with the specific, focused commitment of a person who knows that the alternative explanation exists and is afraid to look at it directly. The replaced bricks made the alternative explanation unavoidable. Geology does not replace bricks. Acoustics does not replace bricks. What replaces bricks is something that has hands, or something that once had hands and retains across whatever interval separates where it was from where it is now. The memory of how hands work. I did not enter the room again after March 16th. I do not believe I was capable of entering the room again after March 16th. I released Reiko and Fumio from the survey that afternoon. I told them the primary documentation phase was complete and that the remaining work was administrative and did not require their presence. Reiko accepted this without comment. She had not been back inside the sealed room since March 14th, and I had watched her become, over the course of those final days, very careful about where she stood in the main corridor, always south, always close to the access ladder, always facing the direction of the exit. Fumio asked me once, before he left, whether I was going to be all right. I told him I was. He looked at me for a moment in the way that Fumio looks at things he has decided not to argue with, and then he packed his equipment and went up through the hatch. Neither of them is named in the official survey report at my request. I do not think what happened in Grid 7 Alpha should follow either of them further than it already has. What I did instead was this. I went back to my field journal entry from the first day, and I reread the note I had made about the limestone band at floor level, 5 meters north of the access hatch. I had logged it as unremarkable. I had moved past it without a second thought. Now I stood in the corridor and looked at it again, the same pale, continuous band, worn smooth, original to the Meiji-era construction, predating the wartime brickwork and everything. The wartime brickwork concealed, and I understood that I had been unconsciously tracking something for days without naming it. Every sound I had heard, every GPR reading Fumio had taken, every anomalous event in the survey had occurred north of that line. The main corridor section where the LEDs had failed was north of it. The access hatch, where the sound had positioned itself on the morning of March 15th, was by a matter of centimeters north of it. The limestone threshold had been there from the first day, logged and dismissed, waiting for me to understand what it was marking. On March 17th, I contacted Mr. Oshiro directly, in person, at the Metropolitan Government Office in Shinjuku. I requested a meeting. I was given a meeting. I presented my findings, the sealed room, the laboratory, the document, the experimental records, the protocol notations on the north wall, and I requested that the site be formally designated for further investigation under the Archaeological Heritage Protection Framework. Mr. Oshiro listened to everything I said. He took notes on his clipboard. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the depth of the brickwork transition and the condition of the document canister. Then he thanked me for my thorough work, told me that the site designation request would be reviewed by the appropriate division, and walked me to the lift. The site designation request was rejected on March 22nd. The rejection letter cited insufficient evidence of historical significance under the applicable statutory criteria. It was signed by a name I did not recognize and had not met. I read the rejection letter 4 times. I read it the way you read something when you are certain you have misunderstood it, certain that a second and third and fourth pass will resolve the confusion. It did not resolve. The letter was very brief, 3 paragraphs, and each paragraph was a complete, grammatically correct, professionally phrased sentence that said nothing. It deployed the language of process and review and statutory criteria in the way that a certain kind of institutional document deploys that language as a wall rather than as communication. There was nothing to push against. There was no specific finding to contest, no particular evidence cited as inadequate, no criteria listed against which my documentation had been measured and found wanting. There was simply the conclusion, insufficient, rejected. Thank you for your thorough work. I called Prof. Murata and read him the letter over the phone. He was quiet for a while. Then he said that he would make some inquiries through the university's administrative liaison with the metropolitan government and that I should sit tight. I sat tight for 2 weeks. His inquiries produced nothing. The administrative liaison reported that the review had been handled by a division whose contact information was no longer listed in the directory she had access to. Naomi Fujishiro had a more direct response. She told me that the closed inquiry she had referenced the one 3 years earlier that had placed a secondary Unit 731 installation in central Tokyo had been closed not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the evidence had been deemed sensitive under a provision of the national security framework that allowed for the suspension of heritage protection procedures in cases involving records pertaining to intelligence activities from the wartime period. She said she had spent 3 years trying to find the legal basis for this provision and had never been able to locate it in any publicly available statute. She said, "Yuki, what you found is real. The rejection is also real. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I do not know what to do about that except to tell you to make sure you have copies of everything in places they cannot easily reach." I already had. But I want to describe what the weeks after March 22nd were like, because I think the record should include not only what I found, but what the finding did to a person who was not prepared for it, which is what a person always is when they find something like this. Because no training program in the world prepares you for a sealed room beneath a Shinjuku convenience store that contains the material evidence of industrialized atrocity and a sound that moves. I am a person with structure. My days have always been structured. I wake at 6 a.m. I run 4 kilometers along the Kanda River. I make coffee with a pour-over filter, and I drink it at my desk while I read for the first hour of the morning. Journal articles and source documents and the kind of slow, careful reading that does not go with a phone in the other hand. I go to the university or to the field. I come home. I cook something simple. I sleep adequately. This structure has been the architecture of my adult life for 11 years, and it has held up against the particular stresses of the work, the mass graves, the firebombing sites, the bones. Because structure is how I have processed the things I have seen and made them into something I could carry without being crushed by. After March 22nd, the structure failed. Not dramatically, not visibly, I think, to anyone outside my immediate circle. I still went to the university. I still submitted the official survey report, the one that described the Meiji-era drainage infrastructure and noted the wartime brickwork transition and made the heritage designation request that was subsequently rejected. I still answered my email. But the first hour of the morning reading stopped, because every text I opened eventually led me back to the same place, and the pour-over coffee got cold on the desk, and the run along the Kanda River became something I did at 2 p.m. or not at all. Because I was spending the hours between 6 and 10 sitting in my apartment thinking about the sound, dividing into multiple rhythms in those final 40 minutes at the limestone threshold, and what that meant about how many of them there were and how long they had been there, and whether what had been done to them had been the worst thing or whether the ceiling had been the worst thing. And I could not determine which it was, and I am still not certain. The document is in a safety deposit box in a branch of the Mizuho Bank in Nakameguro. I transferred it there on the evening of March 16th, the same day we found the bricks replaced. Carrying it out in my survey bag, inside its original film canister, inside a sealed evidence bag I had in my kit for soil samples. I did not take it home first. I went directly from the utility hatch to the bank. 2 copies exist on encrypted drives held by parties I trust. Absolutely. Naomi Fujishiro has a full set of my field photographs. I am telling you this because the question of what is in that room, what the document records, what the experiments produced, what the disposition uncertain notation means, these are historical questions that belong to history. They belong to the public record. They belong to the people whose families were in those jars, on those tables, behind those walls. They have been hidden for 80 years, and I am not willing to participate in hiding them further. But I am also telling you this because of the other question. The question I do not have a professional vocabulary for. The question of what it means that the sound moved, that it crossed 9 meters of sealed concrete and wartime brick in what appeared to be a deliberate progression toward the access point, that it seemed to understand barriers and to understand their absence, that the limestone threshold held when nothing else did, that the last entry on the north wall was August 14th, 1945, which means that whatever happened in that room on the day the war ended happened to people who were alive when it happened. The disposal of the Maruta at Pingfang in the final days is documented. They were killed, they were burned, the records were destroyed, and the facility was demolished. This was the procedure. This was the protocol. But the Tokyo Annex, smaller and closer to home and perhaps more difficult in its logistics, seems to have followed a different procedure. The personnel were extracted. The documentation was ordered, destroyed, but was not destroyed. The subjects, the logs, were sealed inside. Disposition uncertain means they were sealed inside, alive. I have read everything available in the public domain about the phenomenology of extreme confinement, the physiology and the psychology of people who have been sealed into enclosed spaces and survived for periods of weeks or months. I have read the accounts from the mine collapse survivals, from the submarine disasters, from the prisoners held in isolation. I understand what the body does when it is deprived of light and adequate food and social contact over an extended period. I understand what the mind does. I understand the mechanisms of these processes. What I do not understand and cannot account for in any framework available to me is what happens at the far end of those processes. What happens after the body has completed its failure, in the terms that physiology defines failure, and the space continues to hold something that was once inside the body and continues to persist in that space in a form that a ground-penetrating radar unit reads as cyclical pressure variation, and that a woman with a doctoral degree in subsurface archaeological survey methodology, standing at a limestone threshold in the dark with an oil lamp, hears as a sound that divides slowly over 40 minutes into multiple distinct rhythms, each with its own patient cadence, each with its own particular quality, patient and rising at the end of every cycle, like questions that have been forming in the dark for 80 years and have only now, for the first time since the bricks went in, found a gap to direct themselves toward. I am asking you to hold that fact. I am asking you to hold it the way I have held it for 4 years, at 2 a.m, with a cup of cold tea, in an apartment 12 kilometers from a utility hatch, behind a parking attendant's booth, that is still there, that is still accessible, that is still, as far as I know, unlocked. I am asking you to hold it and to understand that the sound I heard in that corridor, patient, rhythmic, rising at the end of each cycle like a question, moving toward the surface with the slow persistence of something that has been waiting for 80 years, was not a ghost in the sense of popular understanding. It was not a special effect. It was not a cultural projection or a grief response or an auditory hallucination produced by stress and subsurface acoustics. It was a record, the way all of this is a record, the way the staining on the floor near the drain outlets is a record, the way the restraint anchors are a record, the way the document in the film canister is a record. The question of what produces that sound, what maintains that rhythm, that patience, that terrible and unhurried quality over the course of 8 decades in the sealed dark, I do not have a professional vocabulary for the answer. I have looked for one. I have read every relevant field in the relevant literature, and I have found nothing that accounts for it within the frameworks I was trained to apply. What I have instead is the limestone threshold. What I have instead is the knowledge that it stopped there, at the boundary of the original infrastructure, at the line that predates the war and everything the war produced. Whatever moves in that sealed space recognizes the threshold. Whether it recognizes it as a limit it cannot cross or as a limit it has not yet chosen to cross, I cannot tell you. I can tell you that the parking attendant's booth is still there. I can tell you the hatch is behind it. I can tell you that there is a band of limestone at floor level in the main corridor at a point approximately 5 meters north of the access hatch, and that as long as you do not cross it, as long as you stay south of it, in the Meiji era drainage infrastructure, in the part of the world that predates what was done in that room, as long as you stay south of the limestone, nothing follows you out. I know this because I tested it on March 18th. I went back alone. I stood at the limestone threshold and I listened, and it was there, north of me, rhythmic and patient and rising. Multiple voices now, if voices is a word I am permitted to use. Multiple distinct cadences in the dark behind a sealed wall, behind 9 meters of wartime concrete, behind a gap in wartime brickwork that I had opened and that had been partially reclosed by something that remembered how walls work. And I listened for 40 minutes, and then I walked south, and I went up through the hatch, and I came out into the daylight behind the parking attendant's booth, and nothing came with me. I have not gone back since. I want to go back. That is the part that I find most difficult to explain to the woman in the gray blazer in the debrief sessions with her clipboard and her careful notes. I want to go back because the document is not the whole record and the photographs are not the whole record. And what is in that room, not the sound, not the thing that produces the sound, but the history, the material evidence, the names that might still be recoverable from those coded identifiers if someone with the right resources applies them to the right archives, that history belongs to someone. It belongs to families who were never told. It belongs to a historical reckoning that the relevant governments of the relevant countries decided in 1945 and in the decades that followed to defer indefinitely. The woman in the gray blazer told me that the review process would be thorough. She told me that all available evidence would be considered. She told me that the relevant stakeholders would be consulted and that an outcome would be communicated in due course. She did not tell me what would happen to the limestone threshold when the utility corridor construction resumed. If you are reading this as part of the formal review process, I have said what I needed to say, and I have said it on the record, and I have nothing further to add. If you found this file somewhere else, if it made its way to you through channels I did not anticipate, through the kinds of paths that documents take when someone decides they should not stay buried, then I need you to do something for me. I need you to remember what I have told you. I need you to remember the word Maruta and what it means and who applied it and who decided it should never be applied to anyone in any tribunal or any courtroom. I need you to remember that there is a room beneath Shinjuku that has been sealed for 8 decades and that what is in it has not stopped. And I need you to remember the threshold. I need you to know that the threshold holds. I need you to carry that with you the way I carry it, not as comfort, exactly, but as the one piece of solid ground in a landscape that shifted permanently on the morning of March 4th, 2019, when I climbed down through a utility hatch and found, beneath the convenience stores and the ramen shops and the perfectly ordinary streets of one of the most modern cities on earth, the evidence that the worst thing human beings have ever done to each other was not something that happened far away, in occupied territory, in a place that could be contained by distance and by time. It happened here. It is still here. And it is waiting patiently at the north side of the limestone line to be acknowledged. If this record found you through the archives, subscribe to Vaulted World Secrets, so the next sealed file reaches you when it is opened. Survival rule. If you are standing in a subsurface space and the sound you hear is rhythmic, patient, and rising at the end as if it is asking you something, do not answer it. Walk south. Find the limestone. Do not cross back north. Whatever is asking has been asking since 1945, and it is not asking for you specifically. It is asking for anyone. It will not distinguish.